Okay, let's get started. So welcome first off to Denis McDonough. It's a real thrill to have you here. And I will start by welcoming everyone to this presentation of the Transformative Visions Speaker Series, a Niagara University presidential initiative in which we host visionaries who have imagined and struggled to create a just future. My name is Dave Riley. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department and Director of International Studies here at Niagara. Thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. This series was imagined and developed by University President Father Marr, who has challenged us to think more deeply about the issues that receive inadequate treatment in presidential campaigning. Our speakers have been invited to offer a vision of America and the world that transcends many of our current challenges and limitations through bold leadership and action. The series began a few weeks back with Dr. Wayne Frederick, who discussed the future of health policy and the intersection of race and healthcare. Tonight, we meet with Denis McDonough to learn about the inner workings of the White House, policymaking, and the people who serve at the core of American government. On October 27th, Dina Gilio Whitaker will speak on indigenized environmental resistance and protection. And on November 17th, Sophia Elijah will present on criminal justice and policing reform. These presentations all center on a key observation. As the 2020 US presidential election approaches, the major party candidates have attempted to define the issues and, for better or worse, to offer a vision of how they would seek to transform America and the world. Historically, however, campaign promises are thwarted, diluted, or ignored, failing in ways large and small to alter the status quo. And increasingly, American presidential campaigns are understood by all participants as vacuous, uninspiring exercises in the manipulation of consumer behavior. And in the contemporary and entertainment media technology complex, the ideals of equality, reasoned deliberation, and participatory democracy are sacrificed on the altar of corporate greed. As Election Day approaches, we can expect to see and hear bold statements about the defining issues of our times and the power of the people to chart our future course. We believe that a fundamentally different approach is needed. The challenges facing America and the world are complex, magnitudinous, recalcitrant to simple solutions. Our students, and indeed all persons living today, need the tools to understand racial inequality, police violence, mass incarceration, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, reparations, access to healthcare, inequalities in health outcomes, the COVID-19 pandemic, environmental degradation, catastrophic climate change, the global refugee crisis, immigration, the sexual assault pandemic, sexual harassment, #MeToo, LGBTQ discrimination, and so many more issues. Niagara University's Transformative Vision series is intended to offer our students a model of inquiry, discourse, imagination, and action. As we draw our inspiration from St. Vincent de Paul, who organized his contemporaries to respond compassionately to people's basic human needs, we hope that this series inspires participants to serve all members of society, especially the poor and oppressed, in local communities and in the larger world. So at this point, I turn to Dr. Jamie Pimlott, Associate Professor in the area of American Government, who will introduce tonight's special guest. Jamie.
Thanks, Dave. Good evening, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Mr. Denis McDonough, former Deputy National Security Officer and Chief of Staff of President Barack Obama. And I have to say that introducing someone who has served at the highest echelons of our government is intimidating enough. But the more I learned about his background and experience, the more nervous I actually became. Those of us gathered here tonight have the opportunity to interact with and learn from someone who has been a part of and party to transformations in our government, and who also believes in empowering others to transform their lives. Mr. McDonough's roots lay in Minnesota, and that is where he began his journey, graduating summa cum laude from St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, with degrees in history and Spanish. After spending time traveling in Latin America, I believe we now call this a gap year experience, he attended Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he earned a Master of Science in Foreign Service. After graduating, Mr. McDonough went to work on the Hill, first as an aide to the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House of Representatives for 4 years, and then in 1999, he became a senior foreign policy advisor to Senator Tom Daschle, a position that he held until 2004. And in case anyone out there doesn't recognize that name, Senator Daschle served as both minority leader and then majority leader in the US Senate during the time Mr. McDonough served as his advisor. In 2004, Mr. McDonough joined the Center for American Progress as a senior fellow, and he remained there until 2007, when he became the senior foreign policy advisor to then Senator and presidential candidate Barack Obama. After his inauguration, President Obama asked Mr. McDonough to serve first as the National Security Council's head of strategic communications, then to serve as the National Security Council's chief of staff, and then in October of 2010, the president asked him to serve as Deputy National Security Advisor. Mr. McDonough served in that position until January of 2013, when President Obama asked him to serve as his chief of staff, a position he held for the president's entire second term. In January of 2017, Mr. McDonough joined the Markle Foundation as a senior principal and served as chair of the Rework America Task Force. There, he focuses on expanding the foundation's partnerships with other organizations such as LinkedIn and various educational institutions in order to expand the range and scope of opportunities available to people so that they may acquire the skills needed to participate in this new technologically driven economy. In 2019, Mr. McDonough shifted roles at Markle. He now serves as the foundation's senior advisor. He is also the professor of the practice of public policy at Notre Dame School of Public Affairs and is a visiting senior fellow of the Technology and International Affairs program at Carnegie Endowment for the International Peace. Mr. McDonough also serves on several other boards of directors, including those of the Technology and Global Policy for Macro Advisory Partners, the National Democratic Institute, and the Tent Partnership for Refugees. I am sure that I likely missed a few of his appointments, and if so, I sincerely apologize. I became distracted thinking about all of the Zoom meetings that you must be attending and wondering when you sleep. So we are very privileged to be amongst those Zoom meetings. So without further ado, please welcome tonight's esteemed speaker, Mr. Denis McDonough.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here with you all, and Professor Pimlott, thank you very much. Professor Riley, thank you very much for the very kind introductions. I regret that I missed Dr. Frederick's presentation a couple of weeks ago on healthcare reform, especially knowing that we're headed into a Supreme Court session where the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, is on the agenda once again. But I know we're going to go right to questions, Dave, but I want to just say basically four things. One is to reiterate my thanks to you two for those very nice introductions. Two is to underscore my admiration for your president, Father Maher. I've gotten to know Father Maher when we served together on the NCAA board. He is a proud leader of Niagara University, and I want you all to know, especially all the students, how vigorously Father Jim fights for student athletes on the board at the NCAA, and what an honor it was to get to know him there. He, in so many ways, reflects the spirit of the Vincentians, as Dave mentioned. I'm trained by the Benedictines and the Jesuits, and now I work for the Holy Cross Fathers out at Notre Dame. But my family has grown up going to organizations associated with St. Vincent de Paul forever. And Father Jim, as well as the organization, the university, really underscores that commitment to social justice and to those in need. And lastly, just to say to the students, thanks very much for giving me some of your time. I know how busy you are, but I also just want to underscore how much I admire the way you're handling this pandemic. we, as a general matter, as we'll talk about during the course of the rest of the conversation, are leaving a lot of unfinished business to you. I just want to say how much I admire you going to school, going to class, managing the pandemic, and just going about your business, notwithstanding the fact that this pandemic has kind of turned your world, as it has turned everyone's world upside down. So hats off to you. Keep on keeping on it, keep slugging away. And just to foreshadow one point that I'll make tonight, which is I hope you all know that Uncle Sam needs you. This government only runs because the best and the brightest of this country continue to volunteer your service to it. And I hope many of you answer that call and head down to Washington to straighten that place out. So thanks so much for the chance to be with you guys.
And we do already have some who are down there, so it's
I know
it's
you
a
do.
good start. Yeah. Just to point out to the audience, we are going to be taking a fireside chat approach. So I dusted off my corncob pipe and I'm ready to go. No patches on the elbows, unfortunately, but I got the tweed as well. So jumping right into it, we're less than 500 hours away from Election Day, a little more than 4 years removed from when you operated in the White House. Are you surprised by where the country is today, where our political system, our campaigning have turned toward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I see Father Jim there. So it's a great question, Dave. I think I'll answer it in this way. Nothing now surprises me about our government. Just in total and utter candor. One. Two is I am happily surprised at one really big thing, and I guess this is the one bit of antidote that I would suggest in light of your opening comments, which is President Trump has been very good for civic participation in the United States. If you look at voter turnout in the midterms in 2018, something on the order of 50.1% of eligible voters turned out for the midterm elections. Now, on one level, that strikes you as relatively small because it's only half of all eligible voters. But if you look at it in terms of precedent and history, 50.1% is the highest voter turnout in a midterm election in 100 years. And so that's something that surprises me and gives me great hope. Every indication is that we'll have massive voter turnout in in less than 500 hours, as you've said. I was just hearing in the news as I was cooking supper for my kids that there's already been almost 9 million ballots cast this year, which seems to portend the same kind of high voter turnout. So that's something that A, I'm surprised at, and B, I'm hopeful about. Then the third thing I'd say is I think President Obama's farewell address in January in 2017 in Chicago, he had a section in that speech where he urged us as kind of citizens of this democracy to kind of get involved. And we've seen an inordinate number of former government officials that worked in the government during our time there kind of throw their hat into the ring on elective office at all levels, from local elections to the mayor, for example, of Scranton is an Obama administration alum, to state level offices. The health commissioner in Maine is an Obama alum, to federal elections, where we've seen a lot of new candidates in the House and in the Senate. And so the other challenge he laid down to us is to engage, even if not an elective office, engage one another, to try to eschew the tweets and the anonymous Facebook posts and kind of distant name calling that comes with social media and engage rather directly with one another in candid, informed discussion and debate. And so I think we're actually seeing a lot of that. I think this session, this series that you guys are having is an example of that. I think I see it in my own life. And that's the one challenge I'd leave them with the students tonight, which is, who are the real voters you're going to talk to and the real interested citizens that you're going to talk to, not just exchange text with or, like a post from, but actually talk to and learn from in the context of this campaign, in the context of this school year. I hope that happens. I'm seeing it more and more. And I think Niagara is a good example of it, including this series.
Now that notwithstanding, I have to say the last thing that I expected was a compliment of Trump and democracy in the same sentence to start off the discussion. But so let me give you an opportunity.
Dave, I just want to note. I just commented about a factual development that I had witnessed. Attached no value to the factual.
Fair enough. So let's talk about a little bit about the Trump administration as it relates to your work. They rolled back many of the Obama administration's accomplishments and yours, some of the biggest ones, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Deal, the Iran nuclear deal, the restoration of diplomatic relations with Cuba. What are your feelings about seeing those successes be dismantled? And in conjunction with that, do you imagine that if Biden wins, there will be an opportunity to immediately reverse some of those successes from your administration?
Yeah, excellent question. Look, I as kind of self-absorbed as it sounds, I'm saddened and disappointed to see that the administration takes after some of these agreements and developments. And I want to just point out one kind of normative issue that I'm sure a lot of the government students and poli-sci students have focused on, and history students, but there's kind of been a tradition in the country that an agreement with an administration, an international agreement, be that an executive agreement or a treaty, but particularly treaties, but including executive agreements that aren't enacted into treaty, have generally been recognized one administration to the next as basically binding American policy. That's because an agreement with the American government is an agreement with the American government, irrespective of how that government takes shape. That norm has been very important in convincing other countries to deal with us over the course of time and to get into negotiations with us. And it'll be interesting to see now that the Trump administration is so fundamentally broken with that norm, what that does to our ability over time to be seen as a reliable partner in the international system. So it's just one, kind of mildly theoretical issue that I think the students, I'm sure, are discussing with you all in class that is worth kind of pointing out the real life impact of it. Now, a political argument will be my second point, which is you don't win elections in the United States by being against things. You win elections in the United States by being for them, which is why I believe Vice President Biden will win, because so far the president has not kind of succeeded in explaining very clearly what he's for, as much as he's declared what he's against, including many of the things we worked on. He's been less specific on what he's for, and then obviously has not handled the pandemic at all in an admirable fashion. Which brings me to the last point, which is, I think the vice president will seek to get back to some kind of understanding on some of these issues we discussed. But I also think that, you never stick your foot in the same river. So in a lot of ways, I think these questions that they have to address will inevitably lead to different answers that they come up with. And I think that's in the nation, that's in the country's interest. I think that's in the interest of the American people, and also incidentally in the interest of the international community. So I don't think they'll go straight back to the Iran deal per se. They may seek to improve it. and then we'll see whether the Iranians are ready to deal. On Cuba, I think that's a pretty open question. I don't, I think the biggest disappointment I have there is that just the thousands and thousands of Cuban families who are unnecessarily separated from one another now as a result of the limitations on travel that have been imposed by the administration, which I think is just foolhardy and even mean-spirited. And then there's other things that I know we'll get into to include the Paris Agreement and other things on climate where, frankly, we just cannot afford to lose any more time in this fight against global climate change. And so I think the vice president will again be focused on that as a priority, but he may choose to do it slightly differently than we did it before, or even significantly differently, which is surely his right. So that's a long answer, Dave, but yeah, am I saddened to see those things go away? Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to be coy about that. I'm disappointed about it.
Yeah.
But I also think that the president has to do a better job of laying out what he's for rather than just what he's against. And in as much as he hasn't, I think that's going to make him a one-term president.
Yeah. So I do want to jump into climate change, and you opened up the door there. But first, I want to hit the Cuba door for 1 second, because you were instrumental.
I see the Cuba flag behind you, by the way.
Yeah, there it is. Yes, we took a group of 20 Niagara University students back in 2017 there, and
cool.
Had an incredible experience. And just a shout out to the administration. It never could have happened if not for the loosening up of the restrictions. So it was a wonderful opportunity. But on a different and related note, one of the areas that you were tasked by Obama to work on was Guantanamo Bay, and you were really prodding Chuck Hagel to make a change to accelerate the release of prisoners. That didn't happen. Is that one of those things that you would point to and either see an opportunity for the future or something that changes the way you think about what can and can't get done in politics?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. First of all, I'm really glad you went to Cuba. It turns out that my wife and my daughter also went in 2017 on a similarly allowable exchange consistent with the new rules. And it's that kind of interaction with people of all nationalities that I think will lead to the kind of change in Cuba that I think so many people want, that surely I know that I want. And I think it's great that you took your students down there. So hats off to you. What an amazing opportunity. The Guantanamo Bay is, I think the thought exercise that's worth doing, Dave, is to think to yourself that right now, the United States of America is holding, let's call it roughly, 3.5 or 4 dozen people in prison without formal charges and without formal hearing. And that, I think you can't help but find that incongruent with our commitment to the rule of law. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the big challenge we face in Guantanamo Bay, is to ensure that we implement the long tradition of American respect for rule of law, even in, especially in the most heinous cases. And so I look back on that and I feel like we made important progress in reducing the number. There's somewhere north of 400 detainees there when we started. There's now, as I say, maybe I forget the number, but let's call it 4 dozen. Many of those were returned to criminal proceedings in their home countries and remain detained. Many of those remain, so we made good progress. I think it continues to be important for us to finish the work there, to get those remaining detainees into a proceeding where they can be held to account through our standard operating judicial proceedings for the heinous activities they carried out, and to end up ending and to end what I think continues, unfortunately, to be a bit of a recruiting narrative for some of our most heinous and brutal enemies, who suggest that we do not, follow our most revered traditions under the rule of law. And so I recognize how hard it is, and I guess your question kind of anticipates that I recognize how hard it is. It does not change my belief in what's accomplishable in our democracy, but it does underscore that these are really hard questions.
Yeah.
I guess I'd say one last thing on this, Dave, at the risk of belaboring or abusing your time. You know, we as a country, especially in the context of the war on Al Qaeda, have remained vigilant and committed to carrying out a commitment to never allow the kinds of attacks that happened on 9/11 to happen again. And for example, the activity in May 2011 that resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden is evidence that kind of perseverance over time can result in the outcome that we are committed to fulfilling, committed to the American people to fulfilling. And we can remain similarly dedicated to ensuring that the detention program at Guantanamo Bay is better informed by our traditions and our values of democracy and rule of law. But it's gonna be hard, and it's gonna take time, obviously.
So let's turn that to the domestic front for a second, because there are some critics who charge that the Obama administration engaged in distinctly illiberal policymaking in the name of security in a couple of specific areas, right? So domestic wiretapping, prosecution of whistleblowers, expansion of classified documents. Does the lack of transparency or the growth of the surveillance state, or however you would term that, under Obama reflect a changing world or a specific reorientation of policy in light of the circumstances that you described?
Yeah. So I think an excellent question. And I do notice that you're not kind of leaving out any, you're kind of going straight to all the easy ones, Dave. So I appreciate that. Yeah. I don't know what the deal is here, Father. He's kind of working.
You opened the door with with your answers. It led right into it. So
yeah. No, look, I mean, this is the beauty of our system, right? Which is that you are held to account and have to answer for the decisions you make.
Yeah.
And I think I'd answer your question in the following way, Dave, which is to say that I think we go through periods in our country where the technology outruns the processes and programs that we have in place to ensure protections, privacy, civil liberties. And nevertheless, the kind of the fundamental structure of the government, with its three competing branches, fighting with one another, actually, among Article 1 in Congress, Article 2 in the executive, and Article 3 in the judiciary, each of them with overlapping responsibilities and powers and capabilities, means that that competition and even invitation to struggle, as one kind of group of political scientists characterized kind of the role of Congress and the executive in foreign policy, which is an invitation for each of them to oversee one another and to struggle with one another. And hopefully in that debate and oversight and whistleblowing, there's greater accountability to the American people.
Mhm.
And so even when the technology outstrips the processes that you have in place for particular protections, the underlying strength of our democratic system, where Congress oversees the executive, where the executive is responsive to the Congress and to the judiciary, means that the kinds of things that you asked about, which I might characterize slightly differently, but I get the point,
Sure.
and I'm not going to fight that.
Mm.
The fundamental checks and balances are ultimately the best protection against it, right? And so, as for example, more people spend more time online, and as for example, different kind of actors online are able to gather and store data associated with people and where they spend time online and what they do online and what they purchase online, requires a new level of vigilance as we develop those tools, for example, to prosecute metadata and big data. But ultimately, if those three branches, the Congress, the executive, and the judiciary, are not fulfilling their roles, well, let's put it this way: when they are fulfilling their roles, abuses will be caught up with, right? Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm doing a great job of answering your question, except to say that I think that I guess I'd call the students' attention to a couple of things that are worth spending some time on. The president went on right around the time of the Snowden revelations, which I think is one of the things you're referring to in 2012 and 2013, I think it was. President went on PBS for an extended interview about U.S. government policy, what Snowden revealed, what it said about our intentions. And he, went to account to really the fourth estate, not the one of the three federal branches, but to the fourth estate, the free press, to answer those questions. Mm-hmm. And in, I think it's either late 2012 or early 2013, the timing escapes me, Dave, but the president gave a speech at the National Defense University about new technology in the prosecution of war. And in particular, the technology of unarmed aerial vehicles, or which he referred to in the speech as drones. And what I think was a quite remarkable, again, public transparent attestation to what we were up to, wherein he made a series of commitments to the American people and to Congress on how he would carry out those activities. All those commitments, by the way, are now summarily ignored by President Trump. But I think that those two are good examples of the president leveling with the American people and with Congress, subjecting our activity to the kind of transparency and daylight that will allow the American people to make decisions for themselves about the kinds of things that we were undertaking. Mm-hmm. And then also subjects us to oversight, questioning, and back and forth, not unlike this right now.
Yeah, sure.
Is that helpful, or is that?
No, it is very much so.
Okay.
And I do appreciate your candor, and I think there is a real distinction between a Trump administration response to that sort of of an issue and what the Obama administration did. And I think that in some ways opens the Obama administration up to greater scrutiny in some ways because of the candor that goes along with it. So
Yeah.
I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting, and so that speech at National Defense University (NDU) in 2012 or 2013, it's worth checking out. It was he or it was him. I'm not sure. The president insisted on giving that speech.
Yeah. Against the
Because
recommendations of the spin doctor?
it wasn't the recommendations of any spin doctor. It was, he felt like he was making decisions about the security of the country, to defend the security of the country, on behalf of the American people, that he wanted to bring to light so that the American people could understand his thinking. But also, he wanted to do it so that he could lay out the limitations and the structures that he put around his activities and his thinking, because frankly, Congress wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he thought it was important not only to explain to the American people, but also to set some kind of limits on these kinds of activities so that other countries, Russia and China, to name two, to just take two, for example, did not somehow try to take greater license because somehow we were being opaque or misleading about what we were up to.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the kinds of questions that I think a government that is working very hard to advance policies based on the informed consent of the American people. These are the kind of steps that we have to take, by the way, that the Russians don't have to take, the Chinese don't have to take.
Right. Absolutely.
And, at the end of the day, it means the policies are less durable and less effective unless you have the informed consent of the American people.
Yeah. And I would suggest that Reince Priebus and Mick Mulvaney and Mark Meadows would suggest that we don't have to take those steps either. And so, that puts you in a different category in that sense alone.
Who knows? Maybe they're watching this right now and thinking, how did Denis get himself in that mess? And it's because when Father Jim asks him to do something, he says yes. So.
Well, let's jump to climate change. You're teaching right now at Notre Dame, and in a policy class specifically on climate change. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're teaching a course that we call Policymaking in the 21st Century, and we're looking at what we think is the biggest challenge of the 21st century, namely the changing climate. And then we're looking at two big policy challenges that flow from climate change, itself a massive policy challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So our first module was, what is climate change? What do we do about it? What are the available options? Next module, which we're in right now, is the first big impact of climate change, which is forced migration. And what is that doing to the international obligations and infrastructure for things like refugees?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third module will be conflict that comes from a changing climate, reduced access to resources, and so forth. And so that's the class. And I'm actually, you probably know this feeling, I'm behind on grading paper. So that's what I'm going to be doing tonight.
Sure. Well, so we solicited questions from the students on a whole variety of different areas. Ellen is a student who will be asking the questions on climate change. So I'll turn it over to Ellen.
Hey, Ellen, I just want to warn you, I've just been raked over the coals by Dave. So
okay.
If you can just cut the guy a break, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, we'll see. Nothing big here. So thank you for speaking with us tonight. So USA Today published in 2013 an article titled McDonough may be the key to addressing climate change. Within it, it said that you understand the threat posed by climate change to national security more than any White House chief of staff in the 21st century. So what environmental policies did you push for within the Obama administration that didn't succeed? How would you solve the climate crisis today? So nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent question. Thanks very much for that. And let me just reiterate one more time, now that I see a student in the face, how much I admire the way you guys are handling the pandemic. I said this in my opening comments, but you guys are handling a whole range of really difficult things, and you're doing it in a really amazing fashion. So hats off to you. It's hard for me to think of any specific environmental or energy proposal that I came up with that we did not implement, because the fact is that the USA Today thing is wrong anyway, because if I say to people all the time, if I can become chief of staff, anybody can become chief of staff. So the fact is that we have the best energy and climate experts in the world, and it was they who were coming up with really profound and good ideas. My job was really to just make sure the trains ran, so those ideas got put into place. But I think the most so full stop. Next point. The most consequential thing we did, which I think will be a trick for the next administration that deals with climate seriously, is that we broke what had been the underlying impasse in the UN climate system going back to the Rio Treaty, which treated developed economies and developing economies differently in terms of their responsibilities to limit current carbon pollution. And the reason I think the reason the president thought it was important to break that fundamental challenge is because it created a political challenge in a lot of places, but in particular in the United States, because it said that a country like China, which currently is the biggest carbon emitter on the planet, albeit they would argue they're a smaller carbon emitter per capita than we are. Nevertheless, they've also recently surpassed the European Union as the second biggest emitter of historic carbon into the atmosphere, which is to say, all pollution going back to the start of the use of hydrocarbons for energy. The way the old system was set, the Chinese, notwithstanding their carbon pollution practices, would have been treated or were treated as a much less stringent level than, for example, the United States or Europe or Japan. And we set out in 2013 to try to work a new way of thinking about this with the Chinese. And I think that's the big breakthrough at the heart of Paris. And so what we did is in 2013, and this is an idea that I tried to press because a good friend of mine, John Podesta, who was the chief of staff for President Clinton and who kind of has been a great mentor to me, raised this idea of trying to see if we could work with the Chinese to reduce hydrofluorocarbons, which are principally a set of gases that we use for refrigeration, for example, but which happen to be particularly noxious climate pollution, that we would seek to get an agreement bilaterally with the Chinese to reduce hydrofluorocarbons under what was called the Montreal Protocol, which, back in the day, Buffalo used to be subjected to this terrible acid rain that was a result of a bunch of pollution from smokestacks and otherwise in the Northeast. The Montreal Protocol helped get our hands around that kind of pollution. And so we set out on a diplomatic strategy to see if we could get the Chinese to agree with us to work to reduce hydrofluorocarbons under the Montreal Protocol. We thought it was important in and of itself because HFCs are such a noxious climate, such a high, such an intense greenhouse gas. But we also thought it was an important test to see if we and the Chinese could come up with a set of standards with one another, to which we hold one another to account, that increased our ambition to address carbon pollution. And so we started that process in late 2013. Secretary Cayley really brought it to fruition. And that led, at the end of the day, to kind of the fundamental part at the heart of the Paris Agreement, which said, everybody's gonna do the best that they can under their NDCs, we called them, their nationally determined commitments, where you determine for yourself how much you can do with the goal of reducing the changed climate to less than 2 degrees centigrade over the course of the century. And so you set your own target, you be as ambitious as you can in that target, and then you subject yourself to transparency and accounting, auditing from the rest of the world. So that's the deal at the heart of the Paris Accord. That is a fundamentally different thing than had been agreed to until the Paris Accord, which, by the way, the United States was not party to any of those previous agreements. And so I guess that's the way I'd answer your question, which is to say, I wish I was coming up with, I wish that USA Today was true, and I wish I was coming up with a lot of really great ideas. Fact is that we had great people who were doing the great work. I was just kind of there moving the trains. But the really big breakthrough was this one, which is recognizing that we in China really owed it to the rest of the planet to lead on this challenge. Now, last thing I'll say on this. At last month's UN General Assembly in New York, it was a virtual General Assembly this year. So everybody gave their speeches by Zoom, which it's good to know that even world leaders have to do this. So next time you're thinking about Zoom class, think, here's President Trump and President Xi and President Macron and Chancellor Merkel, and they're all on Zoom. And, in his speech, President Xi laid down a big commitment to get to zero carbon by, I think, 2060, right? And so the question is China now challenging us? After we challenge them to come to us, are they now challenging us to come to them? Which will be really interesting to see how that unfolds diplomatically over the course of the next several years. Sorry, that was a really long answer and not particularly responsive, but
that's okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So you're I think in some ways you're selling yourself short. Obama was once asked the question, you're out to dinner with your wife and the phone rings, how many people in your life are you I've got to take this? And he answered, Malia, Sasha, maybe my mother-in-law, Susan Rice, and Denis McDonough. How does that feel? It must be an incredible, not only a very positive feeling, but also an incredible sense of responsibility.
It's yeah. So it's a good question. The first thing is, I became intimately familiar with the president's schedule, and I would, unless it was extraordinarily dire, I would not interrupt the president's time with his family.
So he
That's-
knew what was coming if you did call. I
Yes.
see.
But secondly, look, I mean, it is an extraordinarily blessing to be able to go to work every day in that building.
Mm.
I mean, it just is. All the history and tradition and responsibility that resides there is really remarkable. And so it is first and foremost a huge blessing.
Mm.
But secondly, it is very demanding. And that's why I have, like, my kids tell me my hair is so gray it's white. And there it was, I worked in that building for 8 years, and those were 8 very long years.
Mm.
And so, yeah, how does it feel? It feels demanding. It feels, energizing. It feels anxiety inducing. And it just, it also feels like you couldn't do it without 3 things, without, like, in my case, without an absolutely phenomenal wife who really, made the rest of our life work really well. 2, without an unbelievably good team that's looking out for one another. I know you guys talk a lot about management and leadership, and that's without a team that's well functioning, it just wouldn't work well, which is another reason why I think it would be really hard to work in the Trump White House, just because it's so chaotic. I mean, it's chaotic enough even when it's well run. And then the third thing is you just need prayer. I mean, you just wouldn't get it, and to whomever you pray and however you find that strength, you wouldn't be able to make it without it.
Yeah.
So
you now teach at Notre Dame, a notably Catholic institution.
Yes.
2 of your brothers went on to become priests.
Yes.
Given the questions of faith intermingling with policymaking that's been brought up in the context of the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings, how did your faith influence your decisions and your actions in the White House beyond that prayer?
Yeah, that's great. It's an awesome question. I've been thinking a lot about the Judge Coney Barrett hearing. And most of my thoughts are pretty ill-formed so far, so I think I'm going to not say them. But I think that I let me put it, maybe rephrase a question and put it this way. Oftentimes I get the question, how can you, as a good Catholic, work for Democrats? Which is kind of a more coarse way to ask the question that you've asked. And I guess the way I think about it is the following. I'm hired to argue positions. I'm not hired to win every argument. And if I think I'm going to work somewhere where I have to win every argument, well, then my choice is to run to be the president myself, or to be the senator myself, rather than to be an advisor or a staff member or a cabinet member even. And so what I say to people is, in my job, including with President Obama, I think my counsel was often sought because of what I believed, not in spite of what I believed. And that's both empowering, but also a high degree of responsibility. So I always felt like I really needed to be prepared to argue my positions. And I never had the expectation that I would win every argument. And thank God I didn't have that expectation, because I wouldn't have been a very happy camper, because I didn't win every argument. But I'll tell you what, I would not work somewhere where I was not given the opportunity to make the argument. And I wasn't given the respect to hear my argument. And I feel like oftentimes, because of my beliefs, the president sought me out, even on things that weren't, like when I was in the National Security Council, weren't specifically in my job jar, because he wanted to form his thinking, and inform his thinking on that. And then I'll bring this to the last, I'll say two last things. So I felt like I owed it to my colleagues to be fully candid and well prepared in my views on that. And now this is the last point. What I don't get about Judge Coney Barrett is, if she feels as strongly about these things that she does, then she should say them publicly. But to refuse to answer questions suggests to me something different. I don't get that. It almost suggests a lack of respect among the three branches. That somehow, when you're in the job interview, you won't show all your views. But who knows? I mean, we'll see how that unfolds. But I think my faith played a role in my jobs, because my faith plays a fundamental role in everything I do. I think that it made me better as a staff person and as a policymaker. And I take great pride in the fact that I think there's a great tradition of Catholics in public life and Catholics in public policymaking, and Catholics who are graduates of Niagara and graduates of St. John's University and graduates of Notre Dame and Georgetown, who have taken the great training that we get from the Vincenzen, I can't say it well, Father, every time, from the Order of St. Vincent de Paul, from the Order of St. Benedict, from the Order of the Fathers of the Holy Cross, from the Jesuits. All that training has been well employed in defense of the national interest, and I'm proud of that.
Great. Let's turn the question over to Lauren Mencabello, who wants to talk about the Affordable Care Act.
Hi, it's such a pleasure. I just wanted to say, firstly, it's such a pleasure to have you over Zoom. And secondly, to the question. During your tenure as White House Chief of Staff, key provisions of the Affordable Care Act went into effect nationwide, resulting in the expansion of healthcare coverage to an estimated 25 to 30 million people. As the Senate Judiciary Committee conducts confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Judge Amy Coney Barrett, a great deal of attention has been focused on the future of the Affordable Care Act. With the Supreme Court scheduled to hear oral arguments next month in the case challenging the constitutionality of the ACA in California v. Texas, could you talk a little bit about what would happen if the ACA were struck down as unconstitutional? What effect would this have on access to health care? And do you think it's realistic to expect that Congress would enact a new healthcare law to replace the ACA?
Awesome question, Lauren. Thanks for it. So, so I heard Judge Barrett say today that Judge Coney Barrett say today that there's a first order question in this case of California versus Texas. The question which, she said that the question is whether you can sever the principal question from the act. She said that the principal question is, does the individual mandate there was a mandate in the Affordable Care Act that said everybody in the country has to have health care. And if you don't have health care, then you can be punished by the government by fines. And the reason to have a mandate is that if you have a health pool, a pool of people covered by health insurance, if only people who are sick seek health insurance, the program won't endure, because it would turn into what's called a death spiral, because only people who are high cost, who have to use the healthcare system aggressively to treat their illnesses, would get health insurance. Whereas people who are healthy, mainly young men, the biggest outlier are young men, but young men and women, if they don't get health insurance, well, then you'll end up with a death spiral, because you only have sicker people getting health insurance. So the mandate is to try to smooth out the risk in the health pool. So that's point one. So she suggested today that there's a question of whether you can just sever that mandate from the act and leave the rest of the act. And so I guess that's the question that the court will rule on. But the main litigants in the act, which are 25 attorneys general from different states across the country, as well as the Department of Justice and the White House, the US Federal Department of Justice, which has supported the Republican attorneys general, are arguing in their case to throw out the whole act. And so on your question, Lauren, of what will the implications of throwing out the act be, will be several fold. One is the protections in the Affordable Care Act would be terminated. So those protections, there's many, but I'll just highlight the two most popular. And these are the two that you hear Democratic candidates talking about and Democratic senators talking about most today. One is a protection that says an individual healthcare company cannot deny health insurance coverage to someone with a pre-existing condition like diabetes or heart disease or hypertension. And estimates of how many people in the country have pre-existing conditions are somewhere around 1 in 3 people. So about 120 million people have pre-existing conditions. And until the Affordable Care Act was enacted, you could be denied coverage in the individual market if you had a pre-existing condition. You could offer to pay $1 million a month and they needn't cover you. So that's the first protection that would be gone. Another one is a protection that some of you might come into contact with, which is you can stay on your parents' coverage until you turn 26. So it used to be that if you're on your parents' coverage, you could remain covered by your parents until you graduate from college. Now, because of the Affordable Care Act, you can stay until you turn 26, but that would be gone. Another part of the Affordable Care Act expands Medicaid, and expanded Medicaid has covered something like 20 million individuals. And so it's conceivable that a Supreme Court ruling would lead to them losing their coverage. Which brings me then to your last question, which is, could you anticipate Congress enacting a new healthcare system proposal? In this regard, I think the answer is they would have to, because we'd be in the middle of a pandemic. And you have millions and millions of people relying on coverage in the context of the pandemic. And while the course will be heard in the second week of November this year, the ruling will be issued sometime in January or February early next year, I believe. I think there would be great pressure for Congress to come up with a new proposal. And in this regard, what's I think notable is that even though the Trump administration has promised for 4 years to roll out its plan to replace the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, they've not yet been able to do so. Neither have Republicans in the House or Republicans in the Senate. And so the question would then remain, would only Democrats be proposing an Obamacare replacement? And then how would it differ from the underlying statute that's been declared unconstitutional? So my hope is that the Supreme Court doesn't throw it out because it would be a big tangled up mess. and I'd hate to see that happen.
Okay, we'll turn it over to Gabriella for a question.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know you've said before that you'd like to see college become more affordable, and I know that with many colleges struggling since coronavirus, some have said that colleges and universities will never bounce back to what they were pre-COVID. And some have suggested that this is a wake-up call for the entire college industry, and now is the best time for reform. So how would you envision doing this? And do you think the change that we are going to see post-COVID-19 will bring us closer to the goals of affordability?
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. So first of all, questions on affordability need to be handled by Father Jim. I'm teasing. Gabriella, it's a great question. I think I think a fundamental strength of the United States is our college and university system. It's the envy of the world. We have students from all over the world who want to study here, and I can't blame them. It's very much in our interest that they study here, I think. And I think it's a big mistake that the Trump administration has made that harder and harder for foreign students to come to the United States. But I think the fact that so many foreign students want to come to the United States is evidence of this, my first point, which is it's a massive national security interest. It's in fact just a national treasure, our university and college system, one. So, which is to say, the idea that it's kind of on the verge of kind of ending. I've read many of those kind of critiques. I think those are overblown. Two, however, we do have to do a better job of making college more affordable. And there are a lot of things I think that we can do in this space to help students and families with the costs, including by making student loans more affordable, and increasing access to subsidies for college costs. But three, I don't think that'll be enough. And I do think that trying to find new innovations to reduce cost over time is kind of, it seems to me, one of the big challenges for the university system, college and university system. And I don't know what those are yet, per se. But I do think that the institutions that find those innovations and therefore increase access, including for students who have, I think, for too long been kind of shut out, that it includes, unfortunately, students of color and poorer students. The first institutions that break through there are going to be kind of the big winners in a kind of a new university milieu or a new university system. And I just don't know enough yet what those cost reduction options are, but they've got to be out there. And I think partially it comes from increased competition. And then partially it comes from kind of new innovative ways to help students pay for it. So a couple of things that we did when we were in the government, which I think are really attractive, include public service payback plans, which, students who take public service related jobs get preferential treatment in how to pay back student loans. That strikes me as kind of a new innovation that can help over time control costs. Well, my last point is that anybody who wants to go to college in the United States should be able to, in my view. And it would be nice to get to a point where cost is not the deciding factor. And then we have to just create more equitable options for those students who choose not to go to college, and to ensure that we have greater wage growth and equity options for all students from all circumstances.
Great. One of the areas that you've spoken most passionately about is refugees, and you've argued that welcoming refugees is part of the American story. In the midst of the largest refugee crisis since the years after World War II, you advocate for U.S. aid to those nations accepting the largest numbers of refugees and a recommitment to resettle the most vulnerable populations in the U.S. This is an enormous divergence from where policy sits today, right? And where it seems to be directed toward. How do you start turning that ship around? What is the process by which you make that kind of a shift?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Dave. I think for the students who are really interested in this topic, and I think this is the defining topic of the 21st century myself, because of climate and because so many people are going to be dispossessed and displaced. The Holy Father's encyclical, "We're all brothers." It's my kind of, I speak Spanish, Father, not Italian, so that was my translation of the encyclical's title. So I'm sure it's not exactly right. Paragraphs 129 to 132 have an absolutely profound challenge for us on migration and refugees. But to be honest, I think what the Vice President Biden, so for students who are interested in this topic, first is check out the encyclical. Second, check out Vice President Biden's statement released on Medium on World Refugee Day, wherein he makes a series of commitments about refugees that are really the polar opposite of where President Trump is. And so, and by the way, are much more in keeping with the tradition in the US on refugees going back to 1980 with the passage of the 1980 of the Refugee Act. And in that Refugee Act is where we really formalized a process that really began in parishes across the country as a result of Vietnamese refugees who were forced from Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. So many of those Vietnamese who fought alongside us in that war were Catholics, and they were forced to flee. And it was really through refugee resettlement done by Catholic Charities and other religious organizations through parishes that millions of Vietnamese refugees were resettled in the United States. I know that because of our parents. There's 11 of us, and my parents still found time to make sure that we were supporting a couple of Vietnamese families that were resettled through St. Mike's in Stillwater, Minnesota, back in the day. And so, in fact, the vice president, who's laid out a pretty forward-leaning resettlement plan, is much more in keeping with the tradition advanced by Republicans and Democrats going back to 1980 than President Trump is. He's the outlier. And so I don't feel like a return to the kind of tradition that marked the period before the Trump administration is going to be that difficult. However, there is a really big challenge coming, which is so right now, there's something like 70 million people forcibly displaced from their homes. Not all of them are refugees, because refugees have to be forced across an international line. Many are internally displaced people. And every indication is that that number will only increase as the climate gets more extreme because of climate change. So there is a massive challenge, Dave, and it is whether our underlying international agreements for how we treat refugees, which were really written and conceived of in the late 1940s and early 1950s in the context of a refugee crisis in Europe. The question is, are those documents up to a challenge in the 21st century that needs to address not just refugees in Europe, but rather refugees all around the planet, and refugees that will be increasing in number and confronting extraordinarily difficult challenges, to include kind of two big reasons people are moving now that are not recognized in the context of the compacts or the refugee agreements, which is a lot of people are moving because the climate is changing and so there's not enough food or water. And a lot of people are moving because of generalized violence. And neither of those are recognized reasons for people to be categorized or classified as refugees and afforded the treatment and support that refugees are provided under the UN system. And so there is a really big challenge for us, which I don't know the answer to yet, which is how will we deal with those people who are every bit as deserving, it seems, as anybody. And this isn't like a 2030 question or a 2040 question. This is a 2020 question, because the big numbers of people that we see coming from Central America, for example, as you know, Dave, better than anybody, and coming to our southern border seeking asylum, are fleeing generalized violence in Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala. And as currently configured, the international agreements for the treatment of refugees do not envision them being classified as refugees. And my hunch is that that's a mistake and that needs to be corrected. How we correct that over time will be a challenge I think the next president will have to address kind of frontally very early in his presidency, but then the international community is going to have to wrestle with, so that we continue to treat people in the way that, you know, the Holy Father in the encyclical challenges us to do so, which is to treat everybody with the dignity and respect that they're afforded because they're made in the image of God. And that's a big challenge. And it's not like the teaching doesn't say treat some people that way. It doesn't say treat men that way or treat women that way or treat children that way. It says treat every person that way. And that's a massive challenge for us. And that's what I want to dedicate my time, the rest of the time I have on these questions to addressing, because how we answer that question will say an awful lot about how we want to be operating as societies and as governments and as democracies.
That's a wonderfully inspiring answer. Thank you. I have a million other questions, and I should, in the spirit of full disclosure, let you know that most of these questions were actually informed by the students, and you know, they really did a wonderful job of coming up.
They sure did, and they were tough.
Well, that's good. I wanted to talk about international organizations and the U.S. role in these. I wanted to talk about the agencies that the United States has internally, and how certain placements within those have had significant impacts on the future of those. But we have time for one more. So let me ask this, and then I'll turn it over to Father Marr to conclude. What is the one piece, the unfinished work at the White House, that if you were to get the call from Biden or from Harris in 2024, would draw you back in?
That's a great question. So one is, here's something that is probably the most trite sentence you could ever hear, but which is true, which I guess that's why trite things are trite. It's hard to say no to the President of the United States. And I tell people that, you know, you go in the Oval Office and it's a circular room. You go in there and you get confused, you know, because all of a sudden you look around and you can't remember which door you came in. The reason I raise that is because every game in the White House is a home game for the president, right? And so it's hard to say no to the president because you're disoriented, but it's also hard to say no to the president because, frankly, it's a huge blessing to get to work on those challenges every day. So I have a hard time envisioning going back to government service, but I just, the way I answer the question, Dave, is to say it's really hard to say no to him. The unfinished business, though, is this: I grew up in a White House, right? But I didn't really think I'd ever work in the White House. And Lord knows I never thought I'd be the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor or the Chief of Staff of the President of the United States. And so the unfinished business is to just underscore to the students that, as I said earlier, if I can become Chief of Staff, literally anybody can become Chief of Staff. And I say that not in jest, I say that because this whole system only works because the American people make it work. And Donald Trump won't tell you that. And the cynics won't tell you that. But that's the deal. And so the unfinished business is that I hope some of your students on the screen tonight, in your classes tomorrow, follow the footsteps of other Niagara graduates who came down here and went to work for the government. And so what I consider my unfinished business is to continue to recruit. I see every opportunity to talk to students and to people, young people, as an opportunity to recruit. It is we need you. Uncle Sam needs you. Those kind of posters of Uncle Sam calling you to service back in World War II. It's not just in war. It's not just in World War II. It's not just in martial, military matters. It's in everything. We need the best this country has to offer, and that's the students on this screen. So I really hope we can get them down there. And I'll close with one last thought, which is, if you guys can handle going to college, paying your bills, juggling your jobs and your families and your relationships, and doing it in the context of the pandemic, that's the kind of leadership that we're going to need going forward. And so I'll say it for the third time, I really admire what you're doing. And it's exactly the kind of perseverance and tenacity that we really need down here in Washington.
Thank you very much. Father Marr?
Dave, thank you. I just want to thank you and Dr. Pimlott for organizing tonight. It was really tremendous, the questions, and just a great academic exchange, a real laboratory of learning for our students. So thank you both. Denis, I know I owe you. Big time.
Hardly.
So
hardly.
I'll go on the record on that, Denis, but just so great to see you again. And I miss serving on the board of the NCA with you. As I said, it was great being with the people like yourself there. And we're so grateful to have you tonight. And I tell the students that what a blessing it is to be able to hear your experience and see your values, and that you would have sat in the seats that they sat in as college students, majoring in history and Spanish. And I just encourage them to follow your path and to give yourselves over to service a society, whether that's in government or some other entity. But it's just tremendous that you're able to be with us tonight and really offer such a tremendous laboratory of learning for our students. So I'll be in touch with you, but I just want to thank you so much for doing this. And I know you're great in the classroom at Notre Dame, and I hope you get that call to go back into government. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Father. It's really good to see you. And I said at the start before you're on that you're tenacious in your defense of the student athlete in those board meetings, and that's the best that we have to offer. And these guys are lucky to work with you. I'm lucky to have gotten to know you, and you don't owe me a thing. It's been a real great opportunity to be here with you and Dave and Jamie tonight, and with the students. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your candor and your honest reflections, and we hope that we can host you at Niagara University at some point in the future. But thank you so much for tonight. This really
All right,
was a
guys.
wonderful
Thank you so
experience.
much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you
Thanks.
very
Good
much.
luck. Cheers. Good night.
Have a good night. Thank you.